I'm looking at a film that also asks the ontological question, to what degree we actually recognize humans as people that we need to take care of under precarious conditions, also in the Mediterranean, also on the boat, and also reminiscing with some of the ideas that have been brought to the fore today. I'm analyzing Paul Meschuh's film, Boat People, and I'm doing that because it is a film that speaks directly about this idea of violent borders that Rhys Jones has introduced in her book, Violent Borders, Refugees, and the Right to Move from 2016. And this is the quotation I want to start with. Jones argues, globally, more than half of the death at borders in the past decade occurred at the edges of the European Union, making it by far the most dangerous border crossing of the world. At the same time, the upsurge of anti-immigrant messages has fueled extreme right ideologies in several European countries, as we all know. These border regimes produce extremely violent and inhospitable environments, as was also evidenced by Christina, among others, presentations. In my close reading of Paul Meschuh's Boat People from 2016, I want to attend to the cinematographic strategies of storytelling and its appeal to readers' empathy and responsibility. Meschuh's short film employs a particular kind of world making which confronts audiences with the violence of the world's most violent border and speculates about alternative practices of hope and solidarity with refugees shipwrecked in the Mediterranean. Paul Meschuh's short film, Boat People from 2016, turns this idea of hospitality into a concept of hostipitality, right? Where the idea of hosting and being hospitable somehow coalesces. And it uses that as a reminder of the complex colonial entanglements that have shaped the Mediterranean Sea. The film is about a shipwrecked Somali man and his preliminary rescue. I guess school is out. His preliminary rescue by an affluent Western European couple who take him in shortly and then sort of try to figure out what to actually do with him. Over dinner, Musa explains that he actually cannot spend an unpredictably long time in a refugee camp because he needs to work immediately to support his family, urging Hannes and Gerlinde to drop him off at the nearest coast without informing the authorities about it. The next day, after a heated debate, right, so they take him in, they have dinner, he's actually wearing their clothes. After a heated debate in which the couple tells Musa that they cannot get any closer to the coast without the border patrol noticing, Hannes pulls a flare gun on Musa, effectively forcing him to leave the boat about 22 kilometers from the European coast. And you can sort of see the distance evoked here in this long shot. Boat People is a complex tale about morality, responsibility, and constraints, about the visible and invisible borders that govern our daily lives, including the central public discourse in recent years about, among other topics, migration, borders, walls, and the corresponding questions of morality, responsibility, and humanity. All of these themes are embedded into a commentary on mobility in globalized societies. As mobility studies scholar Mimi Scheller contends, 2016, the year the film arrived in our attention, and was awarded the Max Ophüls Prize at the film festival, was a year marked by a number of inhospitable turns in international politics. To quote Scheller, more than 5,000 people died across the Mediterranean. the United Kingdom voted for Brexit based on anti-immigrant arguments. Right-wing xenophobic political parties made gains in many European countries, and Donald Trump won the US presidential election on a nationalist platform of building a US-Mexico border wall and deporting so-called undocumented migrants, end of quote. Following Scheller's thought on mobility justice, these occurrences of immobility are inherently linked to the mobility of upper-class elites, the globally mobile capital, and the discourses concerning mobility as an ontological category of modern lives. Scheller therefore proposes the concept of immobility, sort of, containing the two ideas in one word, to quote, signal that mobility and immobility are always connected, relational and codependent, such that we should always think of them together, not as binary opposites, but as dynamic constellations of multiple scales, simultaneous practices, and relational meanings, end of quote. Meschuh's film depicts this codependency of immobility through the serendipitous encounter between Hannes and Gerlinde with Musa. For Hannes and Gerlinde, the boat symbolizes their social capital and access to leisure. Their mobility in the Mediterranean Sea is made possible by the global flow of capital, which determines their wealth and creates access to the tourism industry. The same boat, however, serves as a symbol of immobility, which ultimately denies Musa the opportunity to cross the Mediterranean Sea and forces him to fend for himself out in the middle of the ocean. The boat is therefore not only a vehicle of transportation, but a space of social interaction where global power asymmetries materialize in complex ways. Hannes and Gerlinde's hypermobility brings them into contact with Musa and confronts them with his immobility in turn. This meeting symbolically enacts the power dynamics between the global north and the global south. The violence of this encounter also becomes tangible through the film's politics of representation. Boat People is at times uncomfortable to watch because its subject matter is uncomfortable to many of the viewers at whom it is perhaps aimed. This is certainly no coincidence. For instance, the extensive use of telephoto lenses and close-up shots in an already confined space like the boat make the experience of watching almost claustrophobic in nature. This technique visually exaggerates what's at the core of the film, namely both the clash and codependence of two seemingly irreconcilable positions. This mise-en-scène illustrates Derrida's contention that the one inviting becomes almost the hostage of the one invited, going back to his definition of hospitality. As Derrida urges, hostipitality is a word which carries its own contradiction incorporated into it, a Latin word which allows itself to be parasitized by its opposite, hostility, the undesirable guest, which it harbors as the self-contradiction in its own body, and which we will speak of again later. Hence, Derrida's introduction of this concept of hostipitality, a hospitality which is not universal or unconditional, but turns actually into a form of hostility. The spatial logic of the boat takes on a particularly important role in this context. The setting on the boat is a plot-driving element within the film. It throws into relief the effects of physical, ontological, and conceptual borders which impact a person's immobility. The boat therefore functions as a heterotope for the film staging of the collision of what the film blurb terms two separate worlds. In Michel Foucault's spatial theory, heterotopias are relational sites, which, quote, have their curious property of being in relation with all other sites, but in such a way as to suspect, neutralize, or invent the set of relations that they happen to designate, mirror, or reflect, end of quote. So Meschuh's depiction of the boat resonates with this definition, in particular in the context of the racial, gender, and national, as well as class contexts that intersect on the boat and in the meeting of its passengers. It is an example of what Foucault calls a crisis heterotopia, in the sense that it exemplifies the current refugee crisis, as well as the long-term repercussions of early modern colonialism and the slave economy on Black lives. In this sense, Hannes's decision to force Musa overboard in a way reenacts the violence of the Middle Passage and the expulsion of millions of Black lives within the colonial slave economy. A more imminent crisis that the film stages is the moral dilemma Hannes and Gerlinde face. Here, the film offers a brief glimpse of hope through the initial act of hospitality on the part of Hannes and Gerlinde when they let Musa onto the boat. Although Gerlinde is suspicious and concerned, Hannes recognizes the need to help first and ask questions later. But it soon becomes clear that their fear of Musa will preclude any and all sustained acts of hospitality. The reasons the fear of the stranger are oftentimes said to be rooted in natural instincts applies here. But as we know from the work of Tabish Kher, for instance, even though this side of the argument prevails in liberal bourgeois discourses, one could without a doubt take the position that every society has been founded on human cooperation and understanding rather than fortification against an outside group. And it's exactly that understanding that is being contested in the conflict that Hannes and Gerlinde ensnare in with Musa. Kher concludes, quote, "What is sometimes presented as quote unquote evidence of a natural fear of strangers is dubiously constructed biodeterminism, not that different from how defunct biodeterminist theories regarding the shape of the skull or the moral and intellectual propensities of skin color in the 19th century operated," end of quote. And indeed, even though Gerlinde is skeptical, her main concern arises from what to do with the stranger after the successful rescue. They both recognize that their obligation to help, but one of them thinks slightly further ahead than the other. And a little later in the film, it also dawns on Hannes that now that they have a bona fide refugee on the boat, they also have created a problem for themselves. Several techniques are employed in the film to visually underline this theme of the impending conflict. Firstly, the change of scenery from day to night concentrates the focus even more on the secluded space of the boat. The pitch black world around them vanishes completely and closes in on the boat. Secondly, the aforementioned use of telephoto and/or close-up shots further works with the transformation of space in order to create dramatic effects. Telephoto lenses, quote unquote, compress space. They make objects appear closer to each other than they actually are. And this exact technique is used when the couple confronts Musa about their plans to call the Coast Guard. It is even more apparent the second time Hannes tries to convince Musa to cross the border the quote unquote legal way in the cabin below deck. The closing in on Hannes's face to a degree that it almost appears distorted is drastically different from earlier instances in the movie in terms of representation when the cabin as well as the actors are filmed from a greater distance. Although the viewer has been given visual proof that Musa is neither a smuggler nor has any motives besides taking care of family, sort of to redeem him narratologically or narratively, through these techniques, a feeling of threat and imminent danger is created. It almost feels as if, as Derrida aptly pointed out, the one living, the one inviting, becomes almost the hostage of the one invited, end of quote. The great feat of the movie is the way in which it represents the most basic of all human needs in a way that feels threatening to Gerlinde and Hannes. It accurately shows how the stranger is perceived as a danger when all they want is to take part in some prosperous meaningful life. In this sense, the film strongly favors the couple's point of view and thereby, by default, neglects Musa's to a certain extent. There is a line of argument which suggests that this fact in itself recreates a power dynamic which favors a colonial perspective on the subject. However, in both people, this technique very much feels like an intended part of the puzzle rather than a mishap. David Bordwell and Kristen Thompson argue that, quote, at any moment in a film, we can ask, how deeply do I know the character's perceptions, feelings, and thoughts, end of quote. The answer will point directly to how the narration is presenting or withholding story information in order to achieve a formal function or a specific effect on the viewer. Thus, the perceived threat that emanates from Musa is created through deliberate misrepresentation, in this case, suspension of information. This instance marks yet another testimony to the intended audience and why the film might be particularly effective in terms of eliciting an emotional response from a European middle-class audience. The unfounded fears on the basis of misinformation are cinematically created and laid bare. The film reenacts how the stranger is created in real life by the stranger's lack of visibility and the resulting lack of knowledge by the host. Because surely, from a humanitarian or a utilitarian perspective, the verdict couldn't be any clearer. A human life counts more than a few years in prison, but nevertheless, it has to be acknowledged that the couple could also find themselves in a potentially life-devastating situation. So-called third-party rescuers have been charged with prison sentences and astronomical fines in the past. Several recent attempts from various political actors to frame NGOs and private rescuers as smugglers epitomize the criminalization of the host or rescuer. Camp Anamur, Sea-Watch, Aquarius, the list is long, as we all know. How even more striking is that the conflict only exists because of the border. Abandon it, and there is no reason for Gerlinde and Hannes to not take Musa with them to the mainland anymore. Thus, the border criminalizes not only Musa for trying to cross it in search of a better life, it also criminalizes the couple's wish to give aid. And it is this border which forces them to decide how much Musa's life is actually worth to them. In her book, Making Worlds, Affect and Collectivity in Contemporary European Cinema, Claudia Breger argues that contemporary film on migration, asylum, and flight employs specific affective strategies to invite audiences to imagine a sense of belonging between themselves and the refugees whose fictionalized lives they witness on screen. This in turn opens up possibilities for audience to develop what she calls layered sensibilities towards the political, economic, and social circumstances of refugees. A multi-layered and sensitive depiction of refugees is therefore part of the crucial cultural work that cinematic representations of migration, flight, and asylum can undertake. Documentary films such as Mariano Agudo's Samba, which we watched in Madrid, for instance, Gianfranco Rossi's Fuoco a Mare, that Felipe will be talking about later, confront audiences with the horrific violence and unfathomable peril of refugees in the Mediterranean. Sensitizing audiences begin with recovering the figure of the other, a taxonomic category which xenophobic discourses render quote unquote sticky or saturated with affect as sites of personal and social tension, to use the words from Zara Ahmed on The Politics of Emotion. Cinema's contribution to anti-racist work is therefore geared towards rehumanizing the figure of the refugee, a sticky figure to which national anxieties can adhere, and as we know, do adhere at all times. In a comparable literary project, Vietnamese-American award-winning author Viet Thanh Nguyen, an editor of the collection The Displaced Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives, contends that, quote, invisible and hypervisible. Refugees are ignored and forgotten by those who are not refugees until they turn into a menace. We who do the ignoring and forgetting oftentimes do not perceive it to be violence because we do not know we do it. But sometimes we deliberately ignore and forget others. In the case of Meschuh's boat people, the confined space on the boat and the claustrophobic mise-en-scène also imply that the white upper middle class European and the African refugee are in this together, symbolically moving on the same ship together and sharing stories, food, and space in a veritable sense of hospitality. For a moment only, the film allows audiences to imagine a utopian vision where the securitized borders do not matter and the three can engage in each other's lives simply as human beings. The potentiality the film affords centers on the true act of compassion and humanity Hannes musters when he saves Musa out of the water. The few minutes of filmic diegesis where he does not ask questions, but simply acts on his impulse to save a human being in an extremely vulnerable situation. The film's affordance of the hopeful moments facilitates what Brager calls, quote, renewed conversations on how to counter exclusion and hate with more positive notions of collective belonging on different scales from the neighborhood or activist movement on the planet, end of quote. And while the film certainly takes on a more violent overtone soon hereafter, this is a moment of compassion and solidarity in which Hannes and Gerlinde realize how much they are actually connected with Musa and how his life, albeit the life of a stranger, resonates with theirs. This awareness of mutual vulnerability is a fleeting moment in Meschuh's film. Once Hannes and Gerlinde start arguing about Musa's stay on the boat. Their dialogue is rife with speech acts which indicate stereotypical assumptions about Black men. This is the moment in the film when Hannes and Gerlinde's hospitality starts to morph into hostipitality for a similar reason Derrida describes in the following way. And what is difficult are the things that don't let themselves be done, and that when the limit of difficulty has been reached, exceed even the order of the possible, end of quote. While they are about Musa's stay on boat, audiences become aware of Hannes's and Gerlinde's own interpellation by the EU border regime and perhaps even empathize with their moral dilemma. The film seems to want audiences to understand that, quote, the hardening of the border through new security practices is the source of the violence, not the response to it, end of quote. Hence, while there are different access to power and privilege allows Hannes and Gerlinde to sail the Mediterranean as though it was a borderless space, the border maintained by Frontex still impacts their own sense of solidarity with Musa and feeling of agency when it comes to deciding how to care about his life. Thank you so much.